All right, welcome back to the Power 2 here on College Football Addiction. TJ Pittinger, Tom Hannifan, Cole Thompson with you. Going to talk a little bit of college football today, what we do every single Wednesday at this time. Boys, how you doing?
Life is good, man. I have zero complaints right now in life other than, there's no college football on right now or any reasonable football. Like, I'm going to watch the UFL. I'm going to watch the CFL because I'm a psychopath, but, just living in it. We're all living in it.
I just had to do a bit with a buddy of mine with toilet paper, so that's on my desk. So you know that you've had a really fun morning when that becomes a thing. I'm going to wipe the ass in the competition when it comes to winning in the NCAA tournament. So join my March Madness bracket at SEC Unfiltered. I'll kick your ass, and I'll go ahead, and if you win and you beat me, I'll give you something in return.
Dude, yeah, Tom, I do miss college football a lot, but I do feel like we get a pretty good reprieve over these next couple of weeks with March Madness. I think that this is my hot take, and we'll move on to football, but the 4 days that we get this week, the Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, are the best 4 consecutive days of sports. Like, there's no other, my buddy that I do the FSU show with argues that the 4 days of the Masters are better. And I'm like, I don't know, man. Like, I'm not
4 consecutive. No, that's the thing.
Yeah. Like, I'm not that juiced up for Thursday at the Masters, right? Like Friday, Saturday, Sunday. Yes. So anyway, I'm going the 4 consecutive college basketball days these are insane. And
what I'll argue is that I think the greatest sporting event is Game 7 of any Stanley Cup playoff matchup, but the 4 consecutive days far and away is this upcoming weekend. And it's better than the Sweet 16 and the Elite 8 for my money.
Yes, because you just get more games, there's more buzzer beaters, more drama. It feels like more upsets. Yeah.
I was talking about this with a buddy of mine. They said they should make the Monday after the Super Bowl a national holiday. I'm sorry. The Thursday and Friday of round 1 of the tournament, that should be a national holiday, in my opinion. Those are the days to where you're not getting work done. You're not doing anything. Just go ahead and take them off and call it a day.
Or just play the damn Super Bowl on a Saturday. Like, just
something. Yeah, why not? Well, no.
Novel idea.
That's weird, but still. I'm not going to get into that today, Tom.
We used to watch the Thursday and Friday. They'd bring in the TV on the cart and we'd watch it in school. My kids are on spring break this week. We never got that. It never lined up where spring break was on this Thursday, Friday. My kids aren't going to watch this tournament. Well, they will in the background, but like, they don't care about this tournament because they're so young, but I'm just like, you lucky dogs. So, yeah. All right, let's get into things that actually relate to college football. Let's start with LSU. I saw an article that they had upped their NIL budget to above $18 million, which I think kind of creates an interesting conversation in a couple of angles. One, we can talk about the LSU kind of expectations, but 2, the House settlement that's coming down. And I've spoken with people at a couple of different schools. It's around $20.5 million. What they're actually going to have out of that to pay current athletes, because you do have to pay some back pay and stuff, is maybe around $18 million. And then that's split up among all athletes. So Georgia has put out kind of their plan for it. It's like 13 to 14 million for football. I think a lot of programs are going to be in that range, 13 to 14 for football, a couple of million for basketball, maybe both sides of basketball. And then everybody else gets everything else: baseball, swimming and diving, gymnastics, whatever, all your kind of non-rev sports. And so if that's the case, and LSU's kind of in that same Georgia vein, right? Let's say they're spending $12, $13 million, $14 million from their cap money, they're certainly going well above the cap. Now, that's, they're thinking $4 to $5 million above the cap. I've heard anywhere from $6 to $8 to $12 million above the cap is what people will spend. So if you're Ohio State and you're spending $25 million, in theory, that's $12 million above the cap, right? Sure. Because you're only, even though you have $18 million, you can only spend 13, or you probably are only spending 13. So I think that's a couple of different angles that we can take this down, a couple of different ways that we can talk about this. Cole, I know you're chomping at the bit to talk about this from the LSU perspective, but I do want to get into some of the other, what teams are spending above the cap, who can't even get to the cap. What does that look like as well? But let's start with LSU.
The big thing with LSU is that they lost out on Bryce Underwood, and they said, okay, well, let's go ahead and invest as much in the transfer portal as possible. We're going to continue to bring in the right recruits, and we're going to flip some kids at the last second to put ourselves in a great position to where year 4, there really is no excuse. I love everything that Brian Kelly has done this offseason, because if he's finally understood the lay of the boot. And when you talk about the state of Louisiana, you should not be losing talents. You should not be losing names to Alabama, to Auburn, to Texas, to Arkansas. Any 4-star recruit that comes in this state should be waiting and salivating to play at LSU. And so what has he done? He's gone out and he's added in the right personnel to bring in the right personnel. What I mean by that is that look at his staff. Everyone in that building has ties to the state of Louisiana. So it's no longer just him hopefully hitting on a few kids that are looking at Alabama and saying, no, I'm LSU, it's my hometown team. No, he's got guys like Lance Guidry, who's gotten experience there. Joe Sloan, who has experience there. Blake Baker, who has experience there. You talk about Corey Raidman in the secondary, a new offensive line coach, Alex Atkins coming in from Florida State. They all have experience. And so you're starting to see them utilize the money properly to bring in the right personnel in terms of the transfer portal, but they're also landing the right 4-star recruits. You add all this together, it's supposed to meet expectations because, guys, if you don't know anything about Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and you don't know anything about the Tiger culture, 8-4 is never going to cut it since Nick Saban has found the key on how to win in that state. Finishing with anything less than double digits is a failure of a season in Tiger Stadium, and it should be. You look at the last 3 coaches that have come through that building. Nick Saban, Les Miles, Ed Orgeron. They've all won national championships. You could argue that Brian Kelly, the all-time winningest coach at a program like Notre Dame, a guy who has come in and proven that he is one of the all-time winningest coaches in college football, is a better coach than Ed Orgeron and Les Miles. And he hasn't been able to do anything other than make it to 1 conference championship in 3 years. And they're invested with this veteran core of offensive pieces. Garrett Nussmeier's in. You bring back Nick Anderson. You feel better about the running game with Caden Durham. You feel really good about the tight end room now of what you've been able to replace with Mason Taylor's departure. You bring in guys like Barry Brown and you bring in Nick Anderson. You have a defense that's going to be headlined by 2 veterans and Whit Weeks, and you throw Harold Perkins back in the star position. This is a team that has realistic goals and should have realistic goals to be competitive enough to make it to Atlanta, competitive enough to be a college football playoff threat, and competitive enough to win multiple games to put themselves in a sheer position to compete for a spot down in Miami and hoist up a national title. I love what they have, and when you throw this type of money in the NIL allocative of $19.8 million, you want to see your investments actually hit. From the 3rd string defensive tackle that was looking at going to a school like Tulane, now going and only playing 12 reps per game, to Garrett Nussmeier coming on back in. You want to see everybody hit because of when you're utilizing that money, that allocation to this football program, you should have realistic goals. And the realistic goals have always been compete for a national championship. With this LSU roster, they should be.
I'm excited about the chances for LSU this season because it does feel like there's opportunity to capitalize in the SEC. And it's not to say that it'll be a down year for the SEC. And as the representative of the Big Ten on this show, I'm not going to sit here and say, oh, the SEC dynasty is dead or any of that stuff.
Thank God, you're smart.
It's a season by season basis, but you can reasonably look at the SEC and say it's wider open this year, I guess. The way I'm looking at it is, you have a pretty good expectation that you feel like Texas and Georgia will be right back into the conversation for potentially the 2 teams representing the conference in the SEC championship. LSU has every opportunity to upset the apple cart, as does an Ole Miss. Auburn, all the money that they have spent, if they really, really put it together, who knows? There are a lot of wide open variables within the SEC. The thing I think that's interesting about the LSU case study in terms of the way that they're spending is that it's a model that you can start to apply elsewhere within the conference and within college football as a whole. The AAC just passed something recently where there's a minimum $10 million spending threshold that you have to do for player reimbursement, something to that ilk. Okay, everybody's stepping up their game. And there are the schools out there, despite them being in the Power 4 or the Power 2, as we like to call it on this show, it's not all of them have 18.5 to put down on college football or 20 to put down on college football, to be specific. So I'm very curious to see, one, which teams are able to spend like LSU. People are loving to knock Ohio State, the greatest roster ever bought this past season. They've spent $20 million on it, allegedly. $34 million spent during the winter cycle for players, recruitment, and coaching staff. That's just kind of the norm. That's the business at this point. And there's always going to continue to be loopholes with this stuff. And I'm sure, Cole, you understand this very thoroughly. And it's a lot of people who have knocked the SEC is that, yeah, before NIL was legal, you just pay a kid under the table, something like that.
It's in a McDonald's bag. You get a number 2 and then you throw in $2 million. That's what we all know. It's the side of fries.
UNC just bumped their scholarships from 85 to 105 for football this upcoming season. And it's kind of a redundancy. It's like you don't need to call it a scholarship. You can just pay a kid, something like that. We're going to talk about Wisconsin in a little while. Xavier Lucas basically broke the transfer portal going to Miami, that it's like, oh, I don't have to go in the portal. I'm just going to go enroll at Miami because I want to play there. And all it takes is some wealthy booster being like, here's X, come to my school, and you'll just leave like any student would. So there's all these loopholes, I think, that are still yet to be closed. The thing that's really going to be critical, and you've already seen this movement, especially in this offseason cycle, is all these franchises, these schools, these teams hiring general managers, hiring NIL experts, hiring data analysts, those sorts of things.
Well, minus Georgia, because Kirby wants to do everything in his own watch.
There you go. So, you have these examples, and it's like, who's going to budget their money the best? Who's going to be the Howie Roseman of college football? How much do you spend on a quarterback? How much is overspending on a quarterback? How much do you spend on offensive line versus defensive line? Like, these are new problems for these college football teams. And LSU is trying to figure it out early. I think they realize, or at least they feel like the Bryce Underwood miss is a big enough deal for them to spark this type of spending. We'll see if Bryce Underwood actually lives up to the hype at Michigan. So there's all these variables out there that I think are absolutely fascinating with this House settlement. But the sooner we close these loopholes, the sooner we can get to an even playing field. But like, I just don't feel like that even playing field is really that close. It feels further away in terms of multiple years, maybe decades.
Tom, what are you talking about with even playing field, though? And I'm not trying to cut off TJ, but like, are we talking about even playing field between the heavy hitters like Ohio State and LSU?
Right. No,
because that's what we're talking about here. Because of
right.
And by the way, anybody who's complaining about Ohio State spending $20 million and they come out with a national championship, the ring speaks louder than anybody online. So just go ahead and shut the heck up while you're doing that. No, but like, that's the even playing field at this point. You are going to start to see parity from these other teams that we look every few years going on runs. Ole Miss, South Carolina, Illinois, Minnesota, these rosters that we feel like they could at least put themselves in a position to go to the playoff. But is that going to create separation between them and the Alabamas and Ohio States and Michigans that can afford any 5-star and then his best friend to come on in who's a 4-star because we're going to take a guaranteed discount and pay just $1,000 more?
I really think you're going to – sorry, TJ, I'm sorry. I really do think you're going to see a day when the Big Ten and the SEC are going to say, enough of this shit. Let's just do this ourselves, because I think there is this imaginary world for college football fans in their head in that, I don't know, UTSA is going to have the exact same salary cap and budget as Ohio State, and everybody can live in this paradise and everybody can compete and all that sort of stuff. And realistically, that's not going to happen.
Yeah, no, but I think what Cole's alluding to, though, is what we've always had. There's always been a haves and have-nots, right? And so evening the playing field is, I mean, how many teams can actually win a national championship, right? Like I've heard people talk about this. You think about, well, there's 6 or 7 in the SEC, 8 in the SEC. There's 5 or 6 in the Big Ten. There's maybe a couple in the ACC. I don't know if there's any in the Big 12 right now. Notre Dame is certainly in there. And that's about it, right? Like think about the last 25, 30 years. Like that's been it. Maybe my numbers are slightly off. Maybe it's closer to 9 or 10 with the additions of Texas and Oklahoma. I'll bump that up a tad. Maybe it's a little bit more in the Big Ten that I'm giving it. But I mean, it's 2 or 3 in the ACC. I mean, historically, who can win a national championship in the ACC? Florida State, Clemson, Miami, right? Who can win one in what's left of the Big 12 right now? I don't know if anybody can, right? And so I think that, you're evening the playing field so that one of those programs doesn't go spend $40 million in 1 year, right? Like and maybe eventually $40 million is our cap, right? In 2 decades. But yeah, I think you're saying, okay, you collectively bargain this thing and you say you got $25 million to spend, right? And if you spend $62 million 1 year, we're not doing that, right? Like and then you do have your next tier, right? Because there are teams that are not going to spend above the cap And there are teams that are not even going to spend the cap. You talked about the AAC. The AAC doesn't have $18 million to spend on athletic. Most of those programs, right? Like, are there some that could? Right. Sure. But they don't have that. I'd say there's Big 12 teams that don't have the additional money.
There's countless Big 12 teams that don't have that.
There's what?
Countless Big 12 teams that don't have that.
Mm-hmm. I think there's ACC teams that don't have that. Wake's not spending that. Syracuse is not spending that. And so I don't know. I think you're just kind of leveling it off to where you do truly have we've always had Division I, Division II. Now they call it FBS, FCS. You're going to have that. You're going to have the Power 2. They can use our name if they'd like to pay us. They can.
I want to retire at 35.
I'm sure they would just take it. But and then you're going to have kind of a sub tier, right? The remaining ACC schools, some of your Big 12 schools, whatever. Like, you're going to have another tier, and then that's it, right? You're going to create 2 tiers of playoffs of systems, and that's what it'll eventually be. They'll have their own playoff. Now, again, is that 10 years from now? Is that 15 years from now? I don't know. But that's what it's all going toward. But I do think you want to get to a point where you don't have a team spending twice as much as another within the same kind of tier, because I don't know that makes a ton of sense.
Sure, but before we move on, the thing that's going to be really beneficial for programs in the ACC and the Big 12, they got to retain the coach. I mean, the second that you watch as Kenny Dillingham continues to do what he's doing down in Tempe, Arizona, and a job opens up at a Michigan or an Ohio State or an Alabama, you got to make sure that he turns it down, because that's the way to where you can at least have that conversation of, hey, I'm buying into this program. I want to change the culture. We only have a 2 or 3 year window to where we can win a national title, but we can win a national title. The problem is that you have all these other programs, LSU, Alabama, Georgia, Florida State, that will do whatever it takes to pay him top dollar to bring him on in and make sure that he is the reason why this program that is spending money with the salary cap that they have can actually win a championship. And by the way, there's been like 5 national champions in the last 10 years. Do you understand how challenging it is to actually win the whole thing? So when you go and have your expectations, also make sure that your expectations go from, hey, we're competing for a semifinal spot. We're competing for a quarterfinal spot.
Yeah, it's one of the biggest problems, I think, with the new way that we view college football. I understand, even in a place like Florida State, right? Everybody at Florida State says, hey, our expectation is to win a national championship. And the reason for that is because in the 90s, they were always in it. They were always competing for that. And that got ingrained in their minds. And if you talk to anybody at Alabama, the expectation, because of Saban being there, is to win a national championship every single year. And I do think that somewhat, not devalues our sport, but there used to be like some pride in having like a 10-win season where you won your conference and you got to go to a big BCS game. Your season didn't feel like a failure. It feels like 133 teams, maybe 133 is an exaggeration, because sometimes you can finish strong and do a little bit better. But it feels like so much of our mindset is now championship or bust, especially with the money that we're pouring into this thing. And I don't love that. I don't love the idea. I mean, think about it. I've been alive for 34 years. My team has won a championship 3 out of those 34 years. I was not old enough to remember the first one, right? And I barely remember the second one. And so this idea of championship or bust, yeah, it sounds good. It sounds good to say, oh, these are our expectations. They're really not. Like, your coach doesn't have that expectation. Does he want it? Absolutely. And at some places like Georgia, Ohio State, on the current run that they're on, sure, that makes a lot of sense. But I mean, that's not realistic. And you're right. Like, it is so incredibly difficult to win that. And I do think that somewhat of that, having that expectation makes every single year feel like a failure, right? Like, Jags fans don't feel like their expectation is to win a Super Bowl every year, right? Like, Cowboys fans want it, but like, they don't feel like that's a realistic expectation. You even go to the craziest, even Lakers fans and Celtics fans, right now, those teams might be good, sure. But like, I think that kind of ruins the idea. And I think that's a direct result of the playoff, to be very honest with you.
Agreed.
All right. We're done ranting on LSU and the house and everything else that's going on. We are going to switch things up today and go to the Big Ten first. We've been giving Cole the floor first more than anybody else, but we're going to go up to Wisconsin today to talk about, among other things, I'm sure Luke Fickell's extension. So, Tom, the floor is yours.
It will get brought up. All right. Wisconsin in 2024 finished 5-7, 3-6 in the Big Ten. They opened 2-0 against Western Michigan and South Dakota. Then they played the Alabama Crimson Tide in week 3. Transfer quarterback Tyler Van Dyke from Miami gets injured on the opening drive. Wisconsin loses 42-10. Then they lose at USC 38-21 in their Big Ten opener in week 5. Quarterback Braden Locke plays okay. He's the starter. That's kind of the story of the entire season, unfortunately. Ripped off 3 straight Big Ten wins versus Purdue, Rutgers, and Northwestern, and then ended the season with 5 straight losses versus number 3 Penn State, at Iowa, versus number 1 Oregon, which was 16-13, a really narrow game that many people watching it live are like, Wisconsin has no business being in this game. Oregon played down. At Nebraska, lost 44-25, and then versus Minnesota, lost 24-7. 2023, to go all the way back, they were 7-6, 5-4 in the Big Ten, and a bowl win over number 13 LSU, as a matter of fact, to cap off the season. Luke Fickell is, I guess, on the key returns list for me, because I think it's maybe the biggest story going on with Wisconsin football right now. He is perfectly 13-13. Reminder, he started during the 2022 Guaranteed Rate Bowl. He has been extended to 2031 as of very recently. We've talked about it here on this show. He makes nearly $8 million per year. And at the end of every season, he has a meeting with the athletic director and the athletic department. And if he has performed in a satisfactory role, he is eligible for an extension. So I guess 5 and 7 was satisfactory. Incoming additions to this team: quarterback Billy Edwards Jr. from Maryland, a little banged up at the back end last season, but he can provide a spark. Wide receiver Mark Hamper from Idaho, big step up in competition, but there's a lot of buzz about him. Tight end Tanner Koziel from Ball State, 6'7" stud. Defensive end Mason Rager from Louisville. Defensive end Tyrese Fearby from Kentucky. You'll see an SEC trend here, Defensive lineman Parker Peterson from Tulane. Defensive lineman Michael Garner from Georgia. Defensive lineman JVR Suggs from LSU, and then quarterback Danny O'Neal from San Diego State, because of a bit of an exodus in the quarterback room. 7 out of 18 transfers are along the defensive line for Wisconsin. Key departures, and this is one I think is actually not getting enough love. Running back Tawee Walker off to Cincinnati. Tawee Walker was very, very solid for Wisconsin. Didn't crack 1,000 yards rushing last year, but Tawee Walker, in a system that was quote-unquote air raid, was pretty much the lone spark for this offense. It's been a very, very, very long time since I can remember a credible receiving threat coming out of Wisconsin. I mentioned him before. Cornerback Xavier Lucas goes to Miami in the transfer portal, but not really in the transfer portal, because he just dropped out of school and just went to Miami, which I thought was the funniest part of all of this college football nonsense. And I'm like, why do we have the NCAA anymore? It just doesn't mean anything. If the SEC means more, the NCAA means nothing. Quarterback Braden Locke, he's off to Arizona. Quarterback Tyler Van Dyke, for some reason, he's still playing football at SMU, apparently. Wide receiver Will Pauling was the number 2 receiver in terms of yardage last season. He is a part of the Fighting Irish. Wide receiver CJ Williams, he's off to Stanford. He was number 4 in receiving yards last year. Offensive tackle Jack Nelson off to the NFL. Offensive guard Joe Huber off to the NFL. And safety Hunter Waller, who was a stud for Wisconsin last year, is off to the National Football League. Recruiting. This was kind of an interesting story, and I want to get Cole's take on this a little bit later, is that you have some decent 4-stars coming in. Linebacker Mason Posa, inside offensive lineman Hardy Watts, edge Nicholas Clayton, defensive lineman Jalen Williams, and offensive tackle Logan Powell. 5 2025 recruits come from the state of Wisconsin. And the tradition and just the identity of Wisconsin football for so long is they're going to dominate their home state because they're just going to recruit those enormous offensive linemen and defensive linemen, and they're pretty much going to stay in their region. Well, this class that's coming in includes players from New Mexico, Massachusetts, Florida, Ohio, Virginia, Texas, Illinois, Arizona, Indiana, Michigan, New Jersey, North Carolina, and Minnesota. It's not uncommon for a team like Wisconsin in the Big Ten to be able to recruit out of state, but that far out of region is definitely an indicator, in my opinion. Okay, their schedule sucks this season, just like it did last season. This year, they're at Alabama on September 13th. This past year, they hosted Alabama. They're at Michigan on October 4th. They host Iowa on October 11th. They host Ohio State, the reigning national champions, on October 18th. They're at Oregon on October 25th. Like, literally from mid-September to the end of October, it just sucks to be a Wisconsin Badgers fan. You're at Indiana on November 15th. You host Illinois on November 22nd, and then you're at Minnesota to finish the year on November 29th. Expectations. For me, I'm looking at 4-8. Schedule's brutal. October alone is murderer's row. There's a chance this team wins 2 non-cons versus Miami of Ohio and Middle Tennessee State, and then goes winless. I do see that as an unfortunate real-world possibility. Again, 4-8 is how I feel, but there's a chance they could peak at 6-6, and that's really the best case scenario. And honestly, for Luke Fickell, I feel like getting to 4-8 would be a real accomplishment. If he does 6-6, he's probably going to get extended to 2032 for whatever reason. There's a likelihood by the time this season ends, they'll have played 8 ranked teams. I mean, they have Alabama, Ohio State, Oregon, Michigan, and Indiana on their slate. And you can look at Illinois and Minnesota and Iowa as potential other teams to be ranked by the end of the season. For me, I was so confused watching this team last year because of Phil Longo, the offensive coordinator. He's now gone. In comes offensive coordinator Jeff Grimes, 30-plus years experience, has served as an offensive coordinator at BYU, Baylor, and Kansas. Broyles Award finalist in 2020 and 2021 at 2 different schools. I think that's an extremely impressive feat at BYU and Baylor back-to-back. Grimes' Kansas offense last year ranked 12th in the nation, over 200 yards rushing per game with a 5.5 average per carry. They were explosive through the air as well, ranking 7th in the NCAA, averaging 14.2 yards per completion. The Jayhawks averaged roughly 30 points per game and roughly 420 yards per game, while ranking 3rd in FBS on 3rd down, converting 51% of the time. So my big question, as I mentioned before, Tawee Walker is gone. Your new starting quarterback is probably Billy Edwards Jr. Phil Longo is out. So can we please put to bed the air raid at Wisconsin? And will Wisconsin get back to more traditional Wisconsin football, or is it going to be more of a modern explosiveness? And not to draw the direct correlation because of Kansas, but when you look at some of these numbers, you do feel a bit of a similarity between what Jeff Grimes did under Lance Leipold and what Andy Kotelnicki did under Lance Leipold. Will he be able to bring some sort of modern look to a Wisconsin offense? If that is the case, I'm looking at breakout players and running backs Darian Dupree and Cade Yakimelli. If this offense showcases the running game the way it was at Kansas and the way Kotelnicki did at Penn State, Dupree and Yakimelli could make people completely forget about Tawee Walker, because Dupree averaged about 4 yards per carry last year. Yakimelli averaged 8.3 yards per carry. My X factor is linebacker Christian Alliegro. This is a defense that no matter what, plays sound, plays disciplined. They're going to play you really tough. I'm very curious to see what their turnover on that side of the ball leads to this year. Alliegro was 1st in sacks, not saying a lot, had 3, but was 2nd in total tackles. Can he ramp up production? And now that you have this influx of defensive linemen in the transfer portal, and especially in this recruiting class, is that going to potentially free him up to be more disruptive in 2025? So yeah, this could be a really rough year for Wisconsin.
Rupp doesn't even begin to say it, in my opinion.
Yep.
I'm not gonna lie, Tom. It doesn't even begin to, like, I look at the quarterback position just to begin with. I like Billy Edwards. I think that it's a fine just for a 1-year rental. Danny O'Neal is the guy that I'm wondering, is he the one that Luke Fickell is kind of throwing all the eggs in the basket, or is he just a backup brought in because of you need to bring in somebody else with Braden Locke going off to Arizona? The schedule is brutal. We can just automatically start there. The other thing that you got to throw in is how much talent they have lost, in my opinion, on the defensive side, to where I'm not sure that they're going to be able to recoup. I also didn't like the Jeff Grimes hire. If I can be completely honest, I understand that you want to move off Phil Longo. I completely get that he was no longer the right OC to run the system, but I was uninspired by how quarterback play was last season out in Lawrence, Kansas, with a guy in Jalen Daniels who had shown you flashes. And also, remember that Jason Bean, who played for most of the 2023 season with Jalen Daniels, was in a very similar, was in a completely different system, and it was a wow factor. I worry about that. I worry about the scheduling. I worry about how their scheduling is with the breaks in between, with the bye weeks. But most importantly, I just feel like that in a year that you need to take that next step forward out in Madison, I don't know if you're going to. Just especially because of the hire that you made at OC.
Yeah, I agree with you. And honestly, I don't feel like there's a ton of pressure on Luke Fickell. And the fact that he got extended and 5-7 was good enough. Why would 4-8 or 6-6 be anything to be really upset about if you're in the Wisconsin athletic department. I just don't think there is a tremendous amount of pressure on them, kind of like we were just saying before. There's pressure on LSU to win 10 games every single year. I just don't think that pressure is on Wisconsin football to deliver in a similar capacity. They're spending with Luke Fickell, and they're clearly spending in terms of going out and recruiting. Are they landing like 5 stars left and right? No, but they're clearly spreading out the map a lot more than they have traditionally. So I'm encouraged by that. Will it yield dividends? I don't think it's going to necessarily be this season. To your point, this schedule sucks, but maybe in 2026, 2027, you see some sort of progress, but who knows?
Does it feel like the extension was made because with the schedule in mind? Just like, hey, we don't want the conversations happening of like, is he on the hot seat? Like, he is our guy. We are bought into him for the future. We believe in what he's building. So we're going to go ahead and extend him now so you don't ask us about it next year when we suck and hope that 26 is better.
I do think it's that, TJ. I think it's weather the storm. And then it is an argument I think comes up a lot in terms of head coaches in college football is who else are you going to go get? And I think there are still people who believe in Luke Fickell. I think what he has done at Cincinnati and what he did briefly at Ohio State has given people enough faith to be like, hey, this guy has something. He should be able to turn it around. And we're competing in one of the 2 premier conferences in college football. So he's getting some resources to do this. But yeah, I mean, like if you were to have fired him after last season, it would have been pretty quick in the grand scheme of things. The extension, I don't think it made a whole lot of sense. And we've talked about that before in this show. So I don't necessarily think he's going to get fired if they have a bad season this year. And it is kind of like you could go get another guy, but you also look at what was going on with Paul Chryst and the involvement of the athletic department more so in terms of what was going on with that football team. All right, did he do that bad of a job? And maybe that's in the back of their heads. It's like, okay, like we maybe shouldn't have moved on from this guy. And now we're stuck with Luke Fickell, not stuck, but like we're sticking with Luke Fickell. Who else are we going to, go get if we oust Fickell? It's
when they offer that extension, I think what it really was a sign of saying we could go 4-8 next year. We could go 6-6. We could go 8-4. He is bought in through 2026 because of that schedule just is so daunting. Mm-hmm. It is so problematic is not the right word because if nothing should be ever problematic for Wisconsin. But the fact that you haven't seen consistent progress and you've actually seen a little bit of regression, an extension to me just says, don't ask about his status going into 2026. He's locked in. We'll have this discussion after 2026.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yep. All right. I never thought that I would be super excited if you'd have told me 2 years ago that I'd be jacked up to do a Vandy preview. I don't know that I would have believed you, but I am kind of excited for this Vanderbilt preview. Can they make a bowl again, Cole? That's the number one question on my mind right now in looking at Vandy's season.
So before we head on into Nashville for 2025, let's look back at 2024. Diego Pavia comes on in, who I call Baba Yaga, because if he is the boogeyman, he is the ultimate nightmare for any team that you feel like has a little bit of that spark, especially if you're in the state of Alabama, because Hugh Freeze lost to him when he was at Liberty. He lost to him when he was at New Mexico State. He lost to him when he was at Vanderbilt. But last season, they started off really strong. I believed that Virginia Tech was going to take that next step forward. Brent Pry brought back 97% of the production. Didn't matter because the legend of Diego Pavia started week 1. Massive overtime upset against Virginia Tech. They get a win against Alcorn State. They lose in sporadic fashion to Georgia State and then double overtime loss to Missouri, or they would have been undefeated going into that matchup against Alabama, and they would have actually been 7-0 to begin the year. Everyone talks about the upset with Alabama. They then carried that momentum into the game against Kentucky and then Ball State before losing 27-24 to Texas. That game really wasn't close. Like, yeah, the score says it was, but it wasn't. Texas was in control all the way up until the fourth quarter. They find a way to get a win on the road again against Auburn, which, again, just seems to be the problem for Hugh Freeze. He needed a quarterback last year. The quarterback that's now beaten him 3 times absolutely was able to go ahead and deliver. Losses to LSU, South Carolina, Tennessee to close out the year. However, they do get a signature win over Georgia Tech in the Birmingham Bowl to close out the season, 7-6. Bowl game, coach of the year, Clark Lee. They return the 2 main elements of that offense from last season. Diego Pavia didn't go anywhere, and neither did his type tight end, Eli Stowers. So those 2 are back. You also still have a very good rushing attack headlined by Junior Sherrill. You also have Jeremiah Dillon coming on in. You also feel really good about your wide receiver room, at least with what you have. That was the wide receiver room. You feel really good about your running back room because if you have Shedrick Alexander and AJ Newberry, Junior Sherrill still is back as your star as your star wide receiver. Transfer portal, they have 4 new starters on the offensive line. Probably the key one that you got to talk about, Bryce Henderson comes on in from South Dakota, was a standout for the Coyotes last year. They also landed Sterling Poacher from Texas Tech. They also landed Gunnar Givens from Virginia Tech. They landed Isaiah Glass, who was a former starting tackle for Oklahoma State. And they also landed Jordan White from Liberty. They brought in wide receiver Trenton Hudson from Mississippi State and a couple of other players that I think are going to be pretty big hits. What they're losing in terms of starting talent was a bit of hit and miss at times. They are losing guys like Quincy Skinner on the defensive side. They're losing CJ Taylor and Ricky Wright, but they were able to bring in decent guys on terms of the transfer portal. The recruiting class. 4-star safety Carson Lawrence. They also brought in Vincent Hinton. They also brought in George Aracori. Their schedule, it's going to be really interesting. I'm not sure what to make of it entirely. I think there's an opportunity for them to still be able to control their destiny. They start off the season off with Charleston Southern. Then they go to Blacksburg to play against Virginia Tech. And I can tell you right now, that is going to be a game where Brett Pry cannot afford to go 0-2. Because remember, Virginia Tech opens the season against South Carolina down in Atlanta. So that is a big-time game for Brett Pry to kind of save his job. Then they go play against South Carolina on September 13th in Williams-Brice Stadium. Other key games you have to look for, Saturday, October 4th against Alabama in Bryant-Denny Stadium. I promise you, the Crimson Tide are salivating at the mouth to have that opportunity. They welcome in Missouri on October 25th. That's a Missouri game they felt like they should have won. They lost at the very last second. Big-time field goal to go ahead and save the day. They play Kentucky, Tennessee, and Auburn to close out the year. I think all 3 are winnable games. What am I looking for from this Vanderbilt squad? Can you duplicate the success? What do we get for the encore of Baba Yaga? Remember, this is a guy that said he wanted to come back. The NCAA gave him the opportunity to get the waiver because if he's playing at junior college. There's a shot to where this team offensively with Tim Bexell as the offense coordinator. I'm not expecting them to be anything more than just a 7-win team. But 7 wins back-to-back years at Vanderbilt shows you that they can be a program that kind of takes over as what Kentucky was in the 2010s, trending upward with the right head coach, eventually becoming a place to where you're looking at other SEC schools like Georgia or South Carolina or Ole Miss, and it becomes a transfer portal destination, very similar to Kentucky. What can we expect from this defense losing so many pieces? And again, it's Clark Lee's bread and butter. It's his IQ, baby. He loves this defense. He took over the play calling last year, said, if I'm going to go down at my alma mater, I'm going to go down my way. Can they find a way to get a few upset wins or play competitive football? What do you look like against Tennessee? What do you look like against Alabama? What do you look like against Missouri? What do you look like against Texas on the road this year? And at the end of the day, can you make it to a bowl game? Because if you do that, number 1, you got the right culture. Number 2, you got the right foundation. Number 3, it was worthy of banking on what Diego Pavia was going to be this year for coming back for another season. And finally, the biggest thing is that it feels like that this is the start of something really, really promising. Breakout player that I'm really excited to see. I think that you bring in CJ Hurd, the safety. He's a really good boundary type of player. I think that he can have tremendous value on this defensive backfield, especially replacing a talent like Ricky Wright. And for my money, the X factor comes down to the offensive line. When you have 4 new starters, how quickly can you gel? How quickly can you mesh in camp to put yourself in a good position blocking for my money, a top 15 returning quarterback in college football that will give you the opportunity to put yourself in a great position where, once again, we're going into the month of November. And the question isn't, is Vanderbilt going to make a bowl game? The question is, what bowl game is Vanderbilt going to make, and how quickly are they going to be able to establish themselves as a team that you want to fear to spoil your shot of going to the college football playoff?
Cole, my question about Vanderbilt is, will the Diego Pavia fairy tale continue, or do you see a point in the schedule when that hysteria is killed?
I think it's going to work because if remember, Tim Beck was the offensive coordinator for him at New Mexico State. So there's already that rapport and that relationship. I think the beauty about what Vanderbilt has done is they've looked at a program like Conference USA, New Mexico State, when they played for a conference championship and said, these guys may not be good enough to win a national championship, but we know what our realistic goals are. 5-7, 6-6, 7-5. Let's go into that range. And as long as we're there, we will be calling this a winning season. We have had tremendous amounts of failure over the last second. I mean, there was 2 years we didn't win a conference game and we beat number 1 Alabama. So I believe that when you look at another year underneath this belt, having a tight end like Eli Stowers, having a good run game headlined by AJ Newberry and Junior. Sorry, I'm running out of words. Cedric Alexander, having a good wide receiver in Junior Sherrill, having consistency in the playbook. I don't think that you need to doubt him. In fact, for my money, I would refuse to doubt Diego Pavia. When you doubt him once, he's already shown you that he can do it. Doubt him a second time, watch how bad it goes.
My biggest fear, I guess I have 2 concerns for Vandy this year. Number one, and I don't know how much, maybe I buy into this too much or buy into the drama of things. I just feel like for Vandy, they snuck up on people last year. And I don't know how real that is this year or not, Cole. I don't know what your thoughts are there. But like, they're not going to surprise anybody this year. You upset Alabama, everyone takes you seriously from there. And so are they able to not catch people sleeping, right? Nobody's going to walk into Vandy or welcome Vandy in and think like, oh, well, this is just an easy win, right? I think that maybe takes other teams' focus level up just a tad. The other part of this is exactly that game you mentioned, that Virginia Tech game. Because if you drop that one and you start out 1-2, so you will be 3-2. I think they win all 3 out of conference against Charleston Southern, Georgia State, and Utah. But then you're looking at, man, you're likely 3-3 after Alabama. You're likely 3-4 after LSU. And you look at a back half of the schedule. Is Texas still the Texas we think they'll be? Probably. Is Auburn as improved as we think they'll be? Probably. Does Nico take that step? And then you're looking, man, you got to upset one of them, right? Even if you beat Missouri and Kentucky, which you would think they've got a pretty good chance to win both those games. Can you find an upset somewhere? That Virginia Tech game feels so big to me. Not that the wheels come off or that they just, I think the culture is right there. I don't think that they just mail it in or anything. But if they could find a way to win that one, if they can avoid the idea of like surprising people, they're not going to do that this year, then I do think that they can make a bowl. Dropping that Virginia Tech game early means you probably got to upset 2 schools down the stretch.
How do you look in the other games as well, like against Utah State and also against a team like Georgia State? Because of
you got lost to last year.
Because if you
lose to Georgia State and beat Bama in the same
exactly. It makes no sense. Your defense was awful. You find a way to be able to score, and then slow and behold, with less than 2 minutes on the clock, you're losing at Turner Field. I mean, like that's what I'm going to be paying most attention to. How much better is this offense looking underneath Diego Pavia in year 2? Even in losses, you could lose to South Carolina by a touchdown. But is this a close game going into the fourth quarter? Are you dismantling Utah State underneath Bronco Mendenhall? Are you taking that next step forward where it's pedal to the metal, no nonsense against Georgia State? Because if you go 4-1 during that stretch and you do beat Virginia Tech, that's a win in itself. But if you're 3-2 and you're playing and averaging 32 points per game and your defense is still playing pretty consistently, that's a recipe to where if you don't give A+ football, if you're Auburn, Kentucky, Tennessee, Alabama, LSU, Missouri, you could be into a dogfight. And that's where I think you want to take the next step forward.
Vandy will be interesting to see this year. And again, I never thought I'd enjoy a segment on Vandy as much as I did today and look forward to. Let's talk NCAA tournament just a little bit. Some controversy with UNC getting in over West Virginia and others. Obviously, West Virginia fans have been absolutely livid about this. A bad year for West Virginia where they got to replace their head football coach, their head basketball coach now going to Indiana, and getting snubbed out of the tournament. As somebody who feels like snubs are just part of life at this point, I've never really felt bad. I'll preface this by saying like, oh, you didn't make the tournament because there were 68 teams that did, right? You were number 69. Nice, but whatever, right? But I do kind of feel bad for West Virginia here, and so I don't know. Thoughts on? Let's start with that. Thoughts on UNC getting in? Their fans feeling vindicated by winning their first round matchup against San Diego State. I don't know that, they were a 5-point favorite going into that game, so I don't know how shocking that truly is. But UNC getting in, Bubba Cunningham, the athletic director there, getting a nice little bonus for his team getting in as the last spot. Is there controversy? Was it wrong for UNC to get in? And then we can also jump into a little bit of tournament talk too.
Cole, if you don't mind, I'll go first on this.
Go for it.
In the world of professional wrestling, which I've worked in for 13 years, there's a inside term that when we say something is produced, we call it a work. It's a bit of a work that the UNC, athletic director gets a bonus for his team hopping into the. Isn't that a little bit too close?
That is a little fun.
A little bit too close, a little bit too interesting there. Listen, from what I understand, the lawsuit against Ripple just got dropped. So take your $104,166.66 that you just made on UNC, unjustifiably making the NCAA tournament, and deposit it into XRP and just see where that crypto goes. Because you know what, Bubba? I guess you deserve it, because this is what college athletics is now, whether it's in college football or college basketball. It's all a work, ladies and gentlemen.
My big takeaway is that if we're just going to go ahead and look at logos and we're not going to pay attention to quad one wins or anything along those lines, then why was Alabama left out of the college football playoff? Or why was South Carolina left out of the college football playoff? Or Ole Miss being left out of the college football
Illinois, damn it.
And Illinois even, and Missouri, damn it. Oh, wait, I forgot. Illinois and Missouri aren't big, bold logos, and neither is South Carolina and Ole Miss. So, of course, that they weren't going to get that same type of nonsense. But you talk about a UNC team that dominated last night in a quad 2 win. It wasn't even a quad 1 game against San Diego State. And people are like saying, well, we're vindicated for that. Well, then let's make the argument for SMU. Now, personally, I was fine with SMU getting in. They made their conference championship. They had the win all the way up until, what was it, the last 5 minutes of that game. So I completely understand why you put them in. But Alabama, whether or not you want to admit it, who lost, I know, to a terrible Michigan squad, I will be the first to say it as the SEC representative on the show. It is inexcusable that Caleb Bohr, with that roster, lost that game. Still beat the number 1 team in the country at one point in Georgia. Dismantled LSU in Death Valley. Was able to put pedal to the metal against a 10-win Missouri squad. Still beat up on what would be considered a quad 1 win in a Wisconsin team. And you're telling me that all of those games didn't matter because they lost to Jackson Arnold? And, oh, wait, I forgot. It still is Oklahoma. It still is the Crimson and Cream, a blue blood institution and a hostile environment known as Memorial Stadium in Norman, Oklahoma. That's not good enough. So just make sure that when we go into the college football playoff moving forward, if the college football basketball committee can say, hey, Indiana and West Virginia, who had signature wins this year, were better in quad 1 games, couldn't get in. This is why SMU and NC State and Arizona are going to be left out of the college football playoff because we only care about branding. That's what I learned from this.
What I would like to see happen is I would like to see, they make such a big deal about the rankings release every year and every week in college football. And they show us these, hour-long specials or 30-minute specials in between 2 games or in between this or that or whatever. And we all, I actually didn't tune into any of them this year except for the last one. But instead of that, why don't you just show us the conversations, right? Why don't you just open up, just let there be some true transparency in how these things are decided. And I don't think that's ever going to happen. I don't know if the powers that be are watching the Power 2 today, but I do think that would be just a way to eliminate some of the questions around it, to really hear what the discussions are, the conversations, because we all know how PR works, right? You get on there after the decisions have been made and you say, well, this is why we did this. But let us hear some of those conversations. Let us hear, why did you truly pick UNC? What was the back and forth there? Or was it just the 12 people sitting around a table saying, yeah, UNC, just write them in, let's go, on to the next thing. So I don't know. I think that'd be a good move for how this is all decided. And again, am I crying tears for a team that finished number 69 out of however many? No. Not really. That's a little different than a team that finishes 5th compared to 4th, right? Or even 13th compared to 12th. But I do think that just opening it up, letting there be some transparency, that would shatter viewership numbers. You think that people tune in for the college football playoff announcements weekly? Give us 2 hours of the committee discussing things on Sunday morning, Saturday night before everything happens here in college basketball. That would break viewership numbers.
Oh yeah.
Because people would want to see it. Now, the very reason that they want to see it is probably why it'll never happen.
Sure.
Because there's a reason that closed meetings in Congress don't happen out on the floor. There's a reason that, discussions between leaders are, you get a 5-hour meeting between leaders of world countries and you see about 30 minutes of it. Right. And so, yeah, it'll never happen. They're not recording President Trump's phone calls with other people, but I do think that seeing some of that stuff would certainly help our frustration with how some of this stuff comes out.
Well, the other thing that you're going to do is you're going to want to see them go ahead and trip up over words because they'll contradict themselves the way that we
100%.
watched the College Football Playoff Committee do it literally every single time last year.
Yep.
Okay, Brett had a good question. UNC and Texas getting into the tournament shows that the Big Ten and SEC are going to expand before 2031. Maybe form a super league, breaking away from the NCAA for football. Does any thoughts on UNC, that angle, that aspect of UNC? Just kind of, this is very much proof that they are a big boy at this table.
I mean, they're a big boy in basketball, and where they go, Duke would go. That would make sense. Very much in the Texas-Oklahoma football model. That would make some sense to me that you would try and package that. But Duke football and UNC football are really not big-time commodities. So, yeah, I mean, I think the SEC's done it in extremely I think the way that they've gone after football and men's basketball to dominate as much of the calendar as possible is the way to go. Big Ten has a lot of catching up to do, so that would certainly help.
Hey, Tom, who are we talking about today? Wisconsin and Vanderbilt? Yeah, that's the football equivalents for UNC and Duke.
Yep.
I mean, it's the exact same. So there we go. I mean, you can welcome on in. Here's the thing that I will always stand behind, and it really is infuriating. The more that we talk about the Super League when it comes to college football, the more we're saying goodbye to actual other sports. Because eventually you will see schools stop paying for those sports because of the Super League is going to put so much of an emphasis on football that all the money goes there. And these other sports, rowing, tennis, swimming, they're going to become second fiddle and they're not going to be able to afford it. So you're hurting yourself and actually helping yourself.
Mm-hmm. Have you guys done your brackets yet? Just rapid fire before we do the wild card. Do you have a Final Four? I do mine on Thursday morning, just for the record. So I don't.
Florida, Auburn, Tennessee, and Duke. I know, spoiler, the SEC guys, 3 SEC teams in. Duke versus Florida in the national championship, Florida winning.
Yeah, Florida's kind of gross to have to see how good they are right now from my perspective, but they are really freaking good. Tom?
I stopped doing brackets when I was 20 years old because I'm a cheapskate and I didn't want to lose $20 every year to something I was never going to get right. So that's how my brain works.
My freshman year in college, I won my bracket and
nice.
My entry. Dude, I made like $4,000. And so like it was like a $30 entry too. And there were hundreds of people in it. I won like $4,000, just short, like 3,800. And so like, I literally have been just playing with house money since. Now, obviously I've spent that money. I've spent it pretty quickly in college, but in theory, I've been playing with house money for quite a while. So yeah, I think Florida does make the Final Four. I'm going to say they don't win because I feel like every year, just the team that you think is going to win. And I just can't mentally do that. But I guess give me Duke to win. Florida's disgusting right now. And, my best hope is that they get rematched with one of those SEC teams that they've dominated and somebody gets payback. So praying for that. All right, on the wild card, this is not really a debate. We'll be out of here in 5 minutes, so appreciate you guys for tuning in and listening today. But Coach Prime, with something that has been said before, this isn't like Coach Prime thinking it up. I've heard multiple people say this. Why don't we just do it? We talked about, the idea. We actually talked about this idea a little bit when we talked about spring games. But puts out that he'd like to play another team in the spring, maybe practice them 3 or 4 times, and then have a game on a Saturday and take them on. Fran Brown responds like, "Hey, Coach, I'm free. Like, let's ride." What are the chances that something like this gets set up? Do you have any pushback on this? It seems like this is a pretty widespread, like, people are supporting it. Now, I know that the NCAA probably isn't because they said everything. But, outside of them, what are you guys' thoughts on this?
This is the one thing from the NFL model that I 100% agree with. What it allows you to do is if you can schedule a home-and-home series, maybe this now doesn't allow you to be able to schedule them in the regular season, but imagine the revenue that you would be able to bring in a home-and-home matchup with these 4 games. You'd be able to see a different type of atmosphere from a different coaching staff, and there would still be value in the spring games. When you sell out the stadium, you're getting to see a legit game. Maybe it's not as impactful. Maybe you see them instead of going through a hard practice. It is a lot like the preseason where, hey, starters are only going to be playing for a drive or two. We're going to have more so our backups in, but it feels like a real game. When you go to a preseason matchup, you still see real football being played in the NFL. I'd much rather see that than see these 2-hand touch, 7-on-7, Pro Bowl-esque matchups than what we're getting currently in a lot of spring matchups.
Even if you did 7-on-7 still, and it was just like, uppers in terms of pads, or even just, no pads, something like that, you still have 2 teams competing against each other. That's what I like about this. Not that the players within one team aren't going to compete against each other, but you have one team flying all the way out to come and compete. The thing I really liked about this is that when I was thinking of teams that would potentially respond, especially on social media, I was not necessarily thinking about Syracuse. Let's make Syracuse sexy again. Fran Brown putting his you-know-what on the table and saying, hey, let's go out and do that. Who wouldn't tune in for 2 days of all-access open media practice between the Colorado Buffaloes, Deion Sanders, and Fran Brown in the Syracuse Orange? I think that'd be so much fun. It culminates with whatever that game looks like. I would love to see something like that. I think this is a great idea for college football.
Hey, and remember, if Fran Brown loses the practice, he doesn't shower. So that could be a really stinky Saturday when he takes the field.
Dude, just their interactions, being able to see those two guys interacting with each other during the practices and stuff, because they'd be standing next to each other, giving each other crap. Like, it would be so much fun. I think there would be a lot of programs that would shy away from this, but there'd be a ton of programs that do this. Kenny Dillingham would do this in a heartbeat. BYU, absolutely. I think Kalani Sitake would do this in an absolute heartbeat. I think Lane would probably do something like this. Like, this feels like a Lane Kiffin type move to me, bringing exposure. I think a Billy Napier would probably do something like this.
Shane Beamer, I think, would 100% do something like this.
I think Mike Gundy would get forced into doing it to save his job, and that'd be entertaining. Yeah.
I think there are coaches that would not do this. Obviously, coming off a 2-10 season, I don't think my coach would do this. I don't know if Cristobal would or not. That's kind of an interesting one. But I think there'd be a lot of fun around it. Dabo would not, 10 years in, he would do it right after everybody else has started. Dabo would finally say, all right, I'll do it. I was the one, there'd be 134 schools. So 2 would sit out. It'd be Dabo and then one other one that didn't have a partner for this. But I think there would be I don't know who would be against this. I wonder though, if the NCAA tries to block it or if it legitimately tries to get set up. Like, has Fran Brown tried to chat with Deion about this more than just a tweet and say like, hey, can we actually logistically do this? I don't see why not, right? It's just chartering a plane. It's interesting. Is there a way in the NCAA blocks it? Do they go to court over it and say like, nah, dog, you can't tell us we're not doing this? I don't know what the rules are around it.
The fear that I would have, just to kind of play devil's advocate, I guess, for the NCAA, is that you don't sign any agreement, and then Deion is looking at a guy who is a second-string wide receiver, and then says, "Oh, our wide receiver tore his ACL in practice. I'm going to steal your player. He ain't going back with you to Syracuse." Like, I think there would have to be some type of an agreement of, hey, if this kid is not entering the transfer portal, you are not here to coax him to come to your school. But besides that, why not? I mean, you give me 48 hours of nonstop conversations between Fran Brown and Deion Sanders. If you're a fan of college football, you appreciate that. It's not a Big Ten SEC 8 versus ACC thing. It is straight up, hey, we got 2 coaches that are must-see television gold. We want them on our screens.
Yeah, without a doubt. All right, TJ Pittinger, Tom Hannifan, Cole Thompson, talking all things college football here on the Power 2. Appreciate you guys, as always, for tuning in. We'll be back live next Wednesday at 1 p.m. Boys, I appreciate you guys for hanging out. We'll talk to you soon.